Sir, I need to see hospital-issued identification before I can let you through this entrance. Dr. Julian Brantley stood at the emergency bay doors of St. Augustine Medical Center at 11:47 p.m., his surgical badge clipped visibly to his scrub top, his phone still buzzing with the trauma page he'd received 4 minutes earlier. "That's my badge, right there," Julian said, tapping it. "I'm the cardiac surgeon on call. I need to get to the OR immediately." Officer Derek Holloway didn't move from the doorway. "Badge photos get faked all the time. I just need you to wait here while I verify." "There is no time to verify," Julian said, his voice tightening despite years of training in staying calm under pressure. "My patient is coding upstairs. She has an aortic tear that's actively bleeding. Every minute you hold me here is a minute closer to her not surviving this." Holloway's radio crackled uselessly on his hip, the battery long dead, though he hadn't yet realized it. "I don't take orders from a badge I haven't confirmed." Behind Julian, a nurse came sprinting through the automatic doors, breathless. "Dr. Brantley, she's crashing. We need you now." "Then go," Holloway said, still blocking the frame with his own body. "Just not through this door until I clear you." Julian looked past him, through the glass, toward the elevator bank that led to the only operating room equipped for what he was about to do, and understood, with a rising, desperate clarity, that the 4 minutes his patient had left were now being spent entirely on convincing one man that he was exactly who his own credentials already proved him to be. Somewhere upstairs, a monitor was already counting down towards 0. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments. I read as many as I can. And if you enjoy powerful justice stories with unforgettable twists like this one, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more stories like this one. Now, let's go back and understand exactly who Dr. Julian Brantley really was. Julian Brantley had wanted to be a surgeon since he was 12 years old, sitting in a hospital waiting room in Baltimore while doctors worked to save his younger brother's life after a car accident that had, in the end, taken him anyway. He remembered, even now, 26 years later, the exact moment a surgeon walked out to speak with his parents. The particular gentleness in that man's voice, even as he delivered the worst possible news. Julian hadn't understood everything the surgeon said that night, but he understood, with the clarity children sometimes have about the things that matter most, that this was the work he wanted to do, to stand in that gap between a family's worst fear and whatever hope medicine could still offer. He'd worked relentlessly toward that goal through college, medical school, and a grueling cardiothoracic surgical residency that left him with less sleep than seemed survivable, and a level of technical precision that few surgeons in the region could match. By 38, Julian had become St. Augustine Medical Center's lead cardiac trauma surgeon, specializing in exactly the kind of catastrophic, time-critical injuries that had taken his brother decades earlier. He was known throughout the hospital for his calm, in a field where calm was rare and precious. Nurses requested him by name during the most chaotic trauma codes. Residents watched him work not just for his technical skill, but for the way he never once raised his voice in an operating room, no matter how dire the situation became, believing deeply that panic solved nothing. A steady hand and a clear mind couldn't solve better. At home, Julian was raising an 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, alongside his wife Elena, a pediatric nurse he'd met during his residency years. Their house ran on a delicate, constantly shifting schedule built around 2 demanding medical careers. But Julian never missed Sophie's school recitals if he could possibly help it. And he'd learned to sleep in short, efficient bursts that let him function on call nights without short-changing his family the rest of the week. That Tuesday night, Julian had been asleep for barely 90 minutes when his phone rang with the trauma page. A 31-year-old woman brought in after a highway collision, an aortic tear actively bleeding, the kind of injury that gave a patient minutes, not hours, before the damage became unsurvivable. Julian dressed in under 2 minutes and drove to the hospital faster than he usually allowed himself to admit, arriving at the emergency entrance with exactly the kind of urgency the situation demanded. He had no idea, walking through that parking lot toward the entrance doors, that the next several minutes would test every ounce of the composure he'd built an entire career around, or that the man about to block his path carried far more history with St. Augustine than either of them yet understood. Derek Holloway had worked security at St. Augustine Medical Center for 2 years, a position he'd taken after being placed on unpaid leave from the city police department, pending a use-of-force review that had, by the time this particular night arrived, already dragged on for 9 long months. Before the leave, Derek had spent 11 years as a patrol officer, and in that time had developed a reputation among certain colleagues as thorough, and among certain community members as someone who applied that thoroughness with a consistency that never seemed to fall evenly across every resident of his patrol district. The incident that triggered his leave involved a stop that escalated far beyond what the situation warranted. Caught partially on a bystander's phone, currently sitting in a departmental review process that Derek believed, with the particular certainty of a man convinced he'd simply been doing his job, would eventually clear him of any real wrongdoing. In the meantime, the hospital security position had felt, to Derek, like a temporary indignity rather than a genuine career, a job he treated with the same rigid procedural mindset he'd carried through 11 years of patrol work, applying rules with an inflexibility that many hospital staff found, at best, exhausting, and at worst, actively dangerous during moments that demanded speed over process. Derek had stopped Julian Brantley twice before this night, both times during late-night trauma calls, both times delaying him for several tense minutes before ultimately verifying his credentials and letting him through. Neither previous incident had escalated to a formal complaint, largely because Julian, exhausted and focused entirely on his patients, had chosen each time to simply move past it, rather than spend energy he didn't have fighting a battle that felt, in the moment, secondary to the emergency in front of him. Derek had never once stopped any of the hospital's other on-call surgeons in this same manner, a pattern that had not yet reached anyone with the authority to formally address it, though 2 ER nurses had already quietly mentioned it to their charge nurse in passing conversations that had gone nowhere. Tonight, seeing Julian move quickly toward the entrance in scrubs rather than a lab coat, badge only partially visible as he adjusted his stride, some old, rigid instinct in Derek decided, within the space of a few seconds, that verification mattered more than urgency, a decision that, unlike the 2 previous times, was about to collide directly with a countdown clock that measured its remaining minutes in single digits. Derek had no idea, standing in that doorway insisting on procedure, exactly how much this particular night was about to cost him, or how deeply, in ways he could not yet imagine, the outcome was about to become personal in a manner no procedural manual could have prepared him for. "Sir, please," Julian said, his voice straining now against the discipline he'd spent years building. "I am begging you. My patient's aorta is tearing further with every minute that passes. I need to be in that operating room. And I need 30 seconds to confirm your identity through the system," Derek said, reaching for the radio on his hip, still not registering that its battery had died somewhere in the last hour. "That's not an unreasonable request." "It is unreasonable," said Grace Talbot, the ER charge nurse who had run out behind Julian, "when the badge is right there, clearly valid. And this is the 3rd time you've done this to him specifically." Derek's jaw tightened. "I don't recall targeting anyone specifically. I followed the same protocol with everyone." "You don't," Grace said, her voice rising now, drawing the attention of 2 more staff members near the entrance. Dr. Reyes walked through this exact door 20 minutes ago in street clothes, and you waved him through without a second glance." A small crowd had begun gathering now, a family in the waiting room glancing up from their own worry, two paramedics unloading a stretcher nearby, phones slowly emerging from pockets as the confrontation stretched past the point where it could plausibly be mistaken for routine. "Ma'am, I need you to step back," Derek said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty, the weight of the gathering audience clearly beginning to register. Julian's phone buzzed again, a text from the OR nurse upstairs. "BP crashing. Need you now." 4 minutes, Julian said quietly, showing Derek the screen, his composure finally beginning to crack at the edges. "That's what the surgical team just told me. 4 minutes before we lose the window to save her at all. You are standing between me and that window right now, over a badge that is sitting 6 inches from your face." Derek stared at the phone screen, something shifting behind his eyes. Not quite doubt yet, but the first genuine flicker of understanding that whatever was unfolding here carried consequences well beyond a routine security check. "Radio's not connecting," Derek muttered, more to himself than anyone else, finally noticing the dead battery light blinking uselessly on his hip. "Then use your own judgment," Grace said. "The same judgment that let a white doctor through in street clothes 20 minutes ago without a single question." The words landed heavily in the crowded entryway, and for a long, agonizing moment, nobody moved at all. Derek standing frozen in the doorway, Julian's phone still glowing with the countdown that had already dropped in the time this confrontation had eaten to just under 3 minutes. The moment stretched, and Julian felt something inside him. Years of discipline, years of staying steady under exactly this kind of pressure, begin to fray in a way it rarely did, even in the operating room. "I am going to walk through this door," Julian said, his voice quiet but absolutely unwavering. "And if you physically stop me, you are going to be responsible for whatever happens to my patient in the next 3 minutes. I need you to think very carefully about whether that's a decision you want attached to your name." Derek's hand moved slightly, some old reflex reaching toward a posture of control that had defined most of his 11 years on patrol. And then, for reasons he wouldn't fully understand until much later that night, he stepped aside. "Go," Derek said, his voice tight. "I'll sort this out after." Julian didn't wait for anything further. He sprinted past him through the automatic doors, down the hallway, into the elevator bank, jamming the call button repeatedly as precious seconds continued draining away. The elevator, when it finally arrived, moved with agonizing slowness, and Julian spent the ride running through the surgical approach in his mind, trying to recover the focus the last several minutes had cost him. He burst into the operating room with just under 2 minutes remaining on the countdown the trauma team had been tracking, immediately scrubbing in as the surgical team briefed him rapidly on the patient's deteriorating vitals. "BP's 60/40 and falling," the anesthesiologist reported. "We need you in there right now, Dr. Brantley." Julian nodded, sliding into position at the table, every ounce of his earlier frustration compressing instantly into the singular, practiced focus that had defined his entire career. "Let's go," he said simply, and the room moved into motion around him. Outside the operating room doors, Derek Holloway stood alone in the hallway, staring at the closed doors, the weight of the last several minutes finally beginning to settle over him in a way that had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with a decision he was only now beginning to understand he might not be able to defend. He had no idea, standing there in that quiet hallway, that the patient behind those doors was about to become the single most consequential detail of the entire night. Not because of anything related to the accident that brought her in, but because of exactly who she turned out to be. The surgery itself took just under 3 hours, Julian working with the same steady, unhurried precision that had defined his career from his very first solo procedure. Repairing the torn section of the patient's aorta through a combination of technical skill and the particular calm that made him, according to nearly everyone who'd ever worked alongside him, the best possible surgeon to have in the room during exactly this kind of crisis. He emerged from the operating room a little after 3 a.m., exhausted but steady, and found the hospital administrator, Charlotte Pierce, waiting for him in the scrub room along with Grace Talbot. Both women's expressions carrying a weight that told Julian immediately that whatever conversation was coming extended well beyond a routine post-surgical debrief. "She's stable," Julian said. "The repair held well. I expect a full recovery, barring any unforeseen complications." "That's wonderful news," Charlotte said. "Julian, I need to tell you something about the patient, and I want you to prepare yourself because I think it's going to be difficult to hear." Julian felt something tighten in his chest. "What is it?" "The patient's name is Rachel Holloway," Charlotte said quietly. "She's Officer Holloway's wife." For a long moment, Julian said nothing at all, the weight of that sentence settling over him with a strange, disorienting force. "He didn't know," Grace added quickly. "He'd just gotten off shift when the accident happened. He was already downstairs waiting when the trauma call came in. He had no idea who was on their way to the OR when he stopped you at the door." Julian sat down slowly on the bench in the scrub room, absorbing the full, strange weight of what he was hearing. That the man who had cost his patient nearly 3 of her 4 remaining minutes had, without any idea what he was doing, been standing between the woman he loved and the only surgeon capable of saving her life. "Does he know now?" Julian asked finally. "He's in the family waiting area," Charlotte said. "He hasn't been told the surgery's finished yet. I wanted you to have a moment before we brought you both into the same room." Julian sat with that information for a long moment, feeling something complicated move through him. Not quite anger, though anger would have been entirely understandable, and not quite sympathy either, though the raw, unimaginable fear Derek must have felt over the last several hours was impossible to fully dismiss. "I need a minute," Julian said quietly. "Then I'll go speak with him." What almost nobody in that hallway yet understood was that the accident bringing Rachel Holloway to St. Augustine that night had itself been caused by a chain of small, ordinary misfortunes that, laid out afterward, would strike everyone involved as a particularly cruel kind of coincidence. Rachel had been driving home from visiting her sister 2 towns over, taking a detour off the highway after receiving a text about road construction ahead. A detour that put her directly in the path of a delivery truck running a red light at an intersection neither driver expected trouble at an hour when traffic was light enough that visibility should never have been an issue at all. Derek had been sitting in the hospital break room at the exact moment the call came through, having just finished a shift that had, coincidentally, included 2 separate incidents where he'd applied exactly the kind of rigid procedural instinct that had, hours later, delayed his own wife's surgeon at the very door, meant to bring help to her. He hadn't recognized the trauma call as connected to Rachel at first. Hospital protocol kept identifying details minimal during the initial page, and Derek, still processing the adrenaline of his earlier confrontation with Julian, hadn't made the connection until nearly 40 minutes after the surgery had already begun, when a nurse mentioned the patient's name in passing conversation near the family waiting area. The moment recognition hit him, according to Grace Talbot, who witnessed it directly, Derek had gone completely pale, sitting down hard in the nearest chair, understanding with sudden, sickening clarity exactly whose life he had personally, however unknowingly, placed at greater risk. He hadn't left the waiting area since. He hadn't called anyone, hadn't eaten, hadn't done anything except sit in stunned, silent dread, replaying the last several hours over and over, searching for some version of events where his own instincts hadn't cost his wife 3 of the 4 minutes she'd had left. Charlotte Pierce, informed of the connection almost immediately by hospital security's own incident log, had made the deliberate decision to hold that information from Julian until the surgery concluded, believing, correctly, that he needed every ounce of undivided focus the procedure demanded, unclouded by the emotional weight of exactly whose life rested in his hands. Now, standing in the hallway outside the family waiting area, that weight had arrived in full, for both men at once. In a moment, neither of them could have predicted walking into the hospital that night. Julian found Derek sitting alone in the corner of the family waiting area, head in his hands, looking nothing like the rigid, procedural man who had blocked the emergency entrance doors just hours earlier. Derek looked up as Julian approached, and something in his face crumbled entirely. Not defensiveness this time, not procedure, just raw, unguarded fear. "Is she?" Derek started, unable to finish the question. "She's stable," Julian said. "The repair went well. Barring complications, I expect her to make a full recovery." Derek's shoulders sagged with something between relief and a grief that hadn't yet found anywhere else to go. "I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking. "Dr. Brantley, I swear to you, I had no idea it was her. If I had known—" "If you had known," Julian said quietly, sitting down across from him, "would you have still stopped me the first time? Or the second time, 2 months before tonight?" The question landed heavier than anything else in the room, and Derek sat with it for a long, silent moment, clearly understanding exactly what Julian was really asking. "I don't know," Derek admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to say no, but I don't know if that's honest, or if it's just what I want to be true about myself right now." Julian studied him for a long moment, feeling the exhaustion of the last several hours settle heavily over his own shoulders. "I've walked into that OR tonight and saved your wife's life," Julian said. "That part isn't complicated. It's the job I trained my entire life to do, and I would have done it for anyone who came through those doors, regardless of what happened at that entrance. But what happened at that entrance is complicated, Derek, and it doesn't disappear just because the surgery went well." "I know," Derek said quietly. 3 times, Julian said. 3 times you stopped me, and never once stopped Dr. Reyes, or Dr. Coleman, or any of the other surgeons who come through that door in exactly the same rush, wearing exactly the same scrubs. Tonight, that pattern cost your wife 3 of the 4 minutes her surgical team told me she had left. I need you to understand that clearly, separate from how grateful I know you are that she survived it anyway." Derek's eyes filled, and for the first time since Julian had known him, however briefly, he didn't offer a single word in his own defense. The formal incident review convened 8 days later, once Rachel Holloway had recovered enough for the immediate medical crisis to no longer overshadow everything else, and once the hospital's internal investigation into the entrance confrontation had gathered enough documentation to move forward properly. Charlotte Pierce chaired the review personally, joined by the hospital's chief medical officer and, at Julian's specific request, an outside representative from the city's Civilian Police Oversight Board. Given Derek's dual status as both hospital security and an officer still technically under departmental review, Captain Robert Hayes, representing the Oversight Board, opened the proceedings by reviewing the security footage from that night. Footage that confirmed, in unambiguous detail, exactly what Grace Talbot had described in the moment. Julian's valid badge, clearly visible throughout the entire confrontation. Derek's radio, its dead battery confirmed through maintenance logs, and, perhaps most damning of all, footage from 20 minutes earlier showing Dr. Samuel Reyes walking through the same entrance in street clothes, waved through by Derek without a single word exchanged. "This pattern isn't new," Grace testified, her voice steady despite the visible tension in the room. I've personally witnessed Officer Holloway stop Dr. Brantley on 2 prior occasions, both times during active trauma calls, both times resolved only after several minutes of delay that should never have occurred given the validity of his credentials from the very first moment. Derek sat quietly through the entire proceeding, offering no defense, no procedural justification, simply absorbing each piece of testimony with the same raw stillness that had settled over him in the family waiting area 8 days earlier. When finally given the opportunity to speak, he didn't reach for excuses. I've spent the last week trying to understand why I made the choices I made that night. And honestly, on other nights before it, Derek said, his voice quiet but clear. I don't have a clean answer. I know what I want to believe about myself. I know it isn't matching what the footage shows. I put barriers in front of a doctor that I never put in front of anyone else who looked less like him and moved just as fast through that same door. I can't undo what that cost his patient that night. I can only tell this board, honestly, that I understand now exactly what that pattern was, even if it took nearly losing my own wife to fully see it. The room absorbed that admission in silence, and Captain Hayes, closing his notes, addressed the panel directly. This board's recommendation, he said, is that Officer Holloway's hospital security position be terminated immediately, and that this incident be formally added to his ongoing departmental review, which we will now be recommending include a permanent revocation of his police certification. Given the demonstrated pattern this incident confirms rather than isolates. The formal consequences moved swiftly following the review's conclusion. Derek's hospital security position was terminated within the week, and 3 months later, the city's police oversight board formally revoked his certification, citing both the original incident that had placed him on leave and the newly documented pattern uncovered through St. Augustine's internal investigation. St. Augustine Medical Center, meanwhile, implemented sweeping changes to its security protocols, replacing subjective, officer discretion-based verification with a standardized badge scanning system that removed personal judgment from the equation entirely, and instituting mandatory bias training for all security personnel, developed in direct consultation with Julian himself. Rachel Holloway, recovering steadily under Julian's continued post-operative care, learned the full details of that night gradually, piecing together over several difficult conversations with Derek exactly what had happened at the entrance while she lay bleeding internally upstairs. She sought Julian out personally during a follow-up appointment 6 weeks after the surgery, finding him in the hallway outside his office. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, "for what you did that night, knowing everything that happened before you even got into that operating room." "You don't need to thank me," Julian said gently. "I would have done the same thing for anyone who came through those doors that night. That part was never in question." "I know," Rachel said, "but I also know what my husband cost you, cost your patient, cost me, honestly, in those minutes. I've asked him for a divorce, Dr. Brantley, not because of what happened medically, because of what it finally made me see clearly, about a pattern I think I'd been quietly excusing for longer than I want to admit." Julian absorbed that for a long moment, understanding the particular courage it took for her to share something so private with the surgeon who had saved her life just weeks earlier. "I hope," Julian said carefully, "that whatever comes next brings you both something better than what led to that night. I mean that honestly, for both of you." Rachel nodded slowly, something like gratitude and grief intertwining in her expression, and after a moment, turned and walked slowly back down the hallway, carrying forward into whatever came next. 6 months after the incident, Julian stood at a podium inside St. Augustine's main conference hall, delivering the keynote address at the hospital's newly established Equity in Emergency Access Training Program, an initiative born directly out of that single, nearly catastrophic night. now expanded into a model other regional hospitals had already begun requesting for their own security staff. Sophie sat in the front row beside Elena, having begged to come along for what she called, with the particular seriousness of an 8-year-old who understood more than her age suggested, Dad's important work day. 6 months ago, Julian told the packed room, I stood outside these very doors, watching a countdown clock in my hand drop from 4 minutes to 2, while the question of whether my credentials were real took priority over whether a woman's life could be saved. That should never happen. Not to me, not to any physician, not to anyone rushing toward an emergency. This hospital exists specifically to answer. He paused, looking out over the room of security staff, administrators, and hospital leadership who had gathered for the program's launch. I don't say this to dwell on what went wrong that night, Julian continued. I say it because the woman on that operating table survived, and she survived by 3 fewer minutes of margin than she should have had. The next patient caught in a moment like that, one might not have 3 minutes to spare at all. That's the entire reason this program exists. Not to punish the past, but to make absolutely certain it doesn't quietly repeat itself in some other doorway, on some other night, to someone who has even less time than she did. The applause that followed was steady and sustained, and afterward, walking out through the same emergency entrance doors that had once cost him nearly everything, Julian felt Sophie's small hand slip into his. Are you proud of your work today, Dad? She asked. Julian looked down at her, then out at the doors themselves, now fitted with the simple, impartial badge scanner that had replaced human judgment with something considerably harder to apply unevenly. I'm proud, he said, that the next doctor who walks through these doors in the middle of the night won't have to convince anyone of anything at all. That's worth being proud of. So tell us, where are you watching from tonight? And what would you have done if you were standing in Dr. Brantley's place, watching that countdown clock while a stranger questioned a badge that was right in front of him? Do you think Officer Holloway's remorse was genuine? Or do you think consequences should have gone even further, given the pattern behind that single night? And what did you think of Rachel's decision at the end? Let us know your favorite moment down in the comments. We read every single one. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe if you're new here, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that every single minute matters, especially to the people trusted to protect them. We'll see you in the next story.